Yeah, good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm always scared of these conferences because I'm not sure how late it was when you all went to sleep, and most of you would like to come to these conferences and hear about specifics about companies. But Vikram has requested me not to speak about companies, but to talk about startups and innovation and stuff like that. Is that all right, Vikram? Is that what you wanted me to speak about? And I normally use these slides, but I won't be using slides this morning because I just wanted to talk with you. I probably have more to take away from you than you have from me. And so I would like to say a few things, and then if there's a little time, get any of the inputs that you may have. Is my voice clear? There's an echo going on. Is it clear to all of you? Okay. So the subject of what I wanted to talk about, I have chosen, is startups and innovation. And I want to describe how I am seeing it in an effort to share on a peer-to-peer basis rather than talk down at you about how great some companies are and some aren't. India is caught up in what I call the startup mania. I do not know whether you agree with me, but because I have seen this from the media, I have arrived at why this is happening and what is it happening. First, it's a global phenomenon. It's happening. I've just come back from China, of course, Silicon Valley. And you people know better about the history of these. But easy funds chasing innovation and entrepreneurship, which has prevailed over the last several years, has probably one factor. So there's a global phenomenon that's going on. Secondly, I think Indians are genetically innovative. I mean, it's in the genes. And that is a bit of the... But the forecast that I have seen, and I don't know how reliable it is, how credible you find it is that it will be a $1 trillion digital economy by 2020. That's not so far away, 2020. $1 trillion. That sounded like an absurdly huge figure to me. So I've been talking with various people, and there are compilations of these things. By the way, that $1 trillion is seen in the context of India having a GDP at purchasing power parity of 7-8 billion in 2020. So it will be 15-20%, which is still sounding to me to be exceptionally high. But nonetheless, I've taken the number not so much for its arithmetical accuracy as for a trend of which way things are going. If you read the Economic Times every morning, you'll get the feeling that there is nothing to India but startups. But all of us know the reality that there are many things other than startups. And in these startups, the old paradigm of trying to make profits, PBT and all the stuff that we were all trained to believe commercial organizations are supposed to do, don't work. They follow some other logic and formula. So I asked myself the question that are these merely legal entities which are destined to be passed on from hand to hand amongst a small group of clubby guys? Are they just commercial machines, paper printing machines? Or is there more to it? And it is that part of it that I want to share with you, rather than justify whether 1 trillion is right or 750 billion is right. So I am imagining, not being the earliest startup that I know of within our business context is when Lux Soap, I used to be the brand manager for Lux Soap long ago. We never called it a startup, by the way. When Lux Soap started getting marketed in India. So I'm now relating from the history book because it goes back to 1924. I wasn't born at that time. But Lux Soap came as the film star soap. But 1924 till 1940, they always used Hollywood film stars. There was not much of an Indian film industry, and the perception was that Indian girls are not supposed to model, and it was not considered socially acceptable. Then something happened between 1937 and 1940. There was a Maharashtrian playwright, I think his name was Gajanan Chitnis, And he used to teach at St. Xavier's College. And there was a young girl called Leela who ended up falling in love with him, and they married, and they had 2-3 children. And so there's Gajanan and Leela Chitnis, middle class Maharashtrians, but highly educated, because if you went to St. Xavier's College in 1930s, you must have been from a reasonably enlightened family, if not enriched family. And they had to earn some extra money in order to make the ends meet. So Leela would accompany her husband, who was directing a Marathi play, I think it was called Raja Harishchandra or something. And she would mend and sew various garments. And then one day, every day she heard the dialogue of the lead actress, and it was getting instilled into her mind. And one day, the lead actress didn't turn up. There was panic, and her husband was very agitated. And I'm imagining now that she could have got up and said, "Mi karto hai, mala ye to." And they put her on the stage, and rest is history. She became the Marathi stage's huge artist. And for the first time, Lux Soap, which was my old employer, went and approached her whether she would model for Lux Soap. I suppose she needed the money, and she agreed. And Leela Chitnis became India's famous film star. What Madhuri Dixit was probably in the 90s, or one of these other younger people are now, she became in the 1940s. I call it a startup because all the characteristics of a startup were present. You had an idea but could never find a context in which to place it. The idea was, can I find an Indian film star? And you were fighting social, cultural, funding norms. Then you found one, and Leela Chitnis was in need of money. So she made a pitch, if I may say so, through her first impromptu acting in Raja Harishchandra. You happened to watch the pitch. You meaning somebody from Hindustan Lever or Lever Brothers, as it was called at that time. They liked the pitch. And they said, okay, we'll put some money behind this lady, and recruited her as India's first film star to model for Lux Soap. And having done so, somebody got the idea, can I become a private equity firm on film stars? And so, I'm now telling you the Lever part of the story. They said, can we put aside a certain sum of money to bet on film stars? And so while Leela Chitnis was ruling the space and had become the Google of film stars, or whatever you want to call it, they started betting on other film stars. And so the strategy was, invest early. When the film star desperately needs publicity, and will come for a small price. So you get shares at par, and then keep raising funds as you go along. And that's how Lux Soap has the largest repertoire of film stars. Probably 70-80% of them never made the big scene. There will be some Rati Agnihotri who acted in 1 or 2 films. This is not to discredit Rati Agnihotri, but to say that she didn't make it into the big league, but there are other people who made it to the big league. And as a result, the cost of equity to Lux Soap was very low, because they had all these film stars they were betting on, and 1 or 2 of them made it very big, and that paid for Lux Soap. It came to an advanced stage in 2000 when even Shah Rukh Khan was sitting in a bathtub with a feather in his ear, posing as, so private equity also became quite adventurous. So I'm mentioning this story to you that the principle on which these startups work is betting on the future. So they're exciting. It's like going, and I'm going to take the metaphor of a family. It's like having kids in the house who are running around, and you're the grandfather, phase I'm enjoying right now, and they're like kids, they're running around, they got ideas, they do silly things, but cute things. But these companies also have a life phase, like human beings, infancy, adolescence, adulthood, and old age. And therefore, we must always remember that the laws of nature apply to early stage, startups, venture stage, whatever you want to call it. If you take the species that nature has created, you have a tortoise which lasts 200 to 250 years. You have an elephant which lives 80 to 100 years. Human beings' lifespan has become average 50 to 70 years depending on which country you look at. But if you look at fruit flies, they have a one-day life cycle. And if you look at the life cycle of a fruit fly, biologists love fruit flies because in one day they can see it going from infancy to old age and dead. And so they can study biological processes and what's happening in a biology before they transplant the experiments onto longer living animals. And so I think startups they are the fruit flies of corporates. Remember, I worked for two companies, Unilever and Tata. They are both 150 years old now, but they were startups in 1850 or 1860 or 1870. So everybody's been a startup. Every company has been through the adolescence, maturity, and old age. And once you get to old age, you're obviously trying to remain young by being fit. And so the cycle is exactly the same. This caused me to then inquire, what makes companies long-lived? Because just like you have a child in your house, you want the child to live long. So you say, Dirghayusha Bhava. And there are certain things you do in your family or society to make people live long. One is to pray to God, second is to visit the temple, third is to keep falling at your feet, and the fourth is to try to inculcate good habits, values, etc. And it's exactly the same with companies. And I acquired a library of books. And I think these are concerns that investors should have, by the way. I'm using the metaphor of life and companies because the connection and the messages are self-evident once I make them. And I hope it is in a small way useful. At the end of my session, the chances are I would have told you nothing which you don't know. But hopefully I would have put it in a way which you will find at least interesting, if not instructive. So I looked at Japanese companies. There are Japanese companies that are 800, 1,000 years old. There are northern European countries, in Sweden and so on, which have companies which are 200, 300, 400 years old. And there are other companies, including the two that I've worked for and I have personal experience of. And out of all the research that people have done and scholars have written, and my own experiences, I have singled out 4 characteristics that you should look for if you're going to find the Leela Chitness of investments. Okay? Because this is always seen as a huckster's job. You're not sure what the rules of the game are, and some satta lag gaya and so on and so forth. But I found 4 characteristics, which I consciously try to use in my own small limited way. Potentially long life companies are first of all tolerant. They are tolerant. They look slightly unfocused, which is opposite of what investors look for. They allow a lot of experimentation on the side. If you look at our nation, ignoring the current political debate, which is not my subject or what we are here to discuss, we've been a hugely tolerant society. Whether we are getting more intolerant is not my subject. Hugely tolerant. And that is why, as Allama Iqbal once wrote, there were 4 civilizations: the Pharaonic civilization, the Indus Valley civilization, the Mesopotamian civilization, and the Confucian civilization. Only one exists in its original form, and that's the Indus Valley civilization. The Pharaonic civilization is in museums, so also the Mesopotamian civilization, so also the Chinese civilization. So there is something to be said for tolerance. And you will find that long-living companies, both Unilever and Tata, allow their people, although they look like bureaucracies from outside, to do small experimentation on the side, and they ignore it. They encourage it. So Unilever went into United Africa Company. It used to sell timber down the river Niger and make lots of money. When I joined Unilever in 1967, 33% of the profit of global Unilever came from Africa. 33. We were dependent on Africa in 1967 to 1975, I remember very well. So the first characteristic is the opposite of what investors look for. They're tolerant. You can be focused and yet tolerant, which means there's a combination of tolerance and intolerance. Not intolerance, lack of focus. The second characteristic I found was self-evident and doesn't require too much explanation, that they're hugely adaptive. You see this in nature as well. They're prepared for stress. They know it will not go right, but they're prepared for it, financially, motivationally, and so on and so forth. The third is that they have a very coherent image. Who are we is something that they define and they stay steady with. They don't keep changing it every time the CEO changes. You look at HP, which is an iconic company 30 years ago. And then various people came and they changed what HP is all about. Well, HP is not the same HP that it used to be. Whereas I know the industries are different, the times are different, and the comparisons may have some limitations. But in 1886, somebody asked William Hesketh Lever, what does Unilever stand for? He said, for a long time ahead, Unilever will continue to clean the steaming millions around the world. Very elegantly simple statement. We will clean teeming millions around the world. Global strategy, lots of poor people, and we'll keep cleaning them. Now, whether you give them a powder to put on the face or a Lakme lipstick, it's a form of cleaning or enhanced cleaning. You must look good. You look at Jamsetji Tata, he said, we are there because we are a part of the community. We must return the money we've taken from the community. And he said that in 1887 or something. And it still is the operating philosophy. So I think there's a coherence about the brand, and they don't keep changing. Whereas markets today are looking for new CEOs with new strategies. And then they all get excited and comment on it. And I sometimes wonder, at the risk of appearing old-fashioned, whether they are missing the right signal of coherence. And the last one, tolerant, adaptive, coherent, they're conservative. They are not what the books tell you. They are dreamers, but they are conservative when it comes to finance. They spend the money as if it's their own money. They are not guys who blow up other people's money. Whereas the trend that you find now seems to be, a company which has a revenue of $20 million is spending $200 million on advertising on the basis that is the model. And maybe I'm old-fashioned. I can't figure it out quite exactly. But long-lasting companies don't do that. So it's like a child. You may say that the best way to raise a child is to give him lots of pocket money and let him do all sorts of things, and he'll figure out for himself what's good for him. But actually, a little bit of self-denial is the key to long life for human beings, and discipline. And so it's the same with companies. So when I look at startups, and we do have startups, by the way, they are not of the variety that you read about in the newspaper, but within Tatas, within Levers, there are startup activities going on all the time, even in large companies. And I've given you one old example of Leela Chitnis, but there are others going on all the time. I have found it useful in my experience, which I'm offering as a peer conversation with you, that this is what creates long life companies. The idea that I'll just encash and get out in 5 minutes, in 5 days, in 5 months or 5 years, may be an approach, but if you fail to put these into the company, then I think you're missing a lot for the future. So then the question arises, all right, you have taken the metaphor of startup companies as like children in a family. You have taken the metaphor of what makes Dheergayus. You have now got the startup company. What are the risks to that baby so that it can stay Dheergayus? If it doesn't survive, then it doesn't become a subject. And there are two things, just like a baby. The first is natural predators. There are bacteria, there are disease, virus. I don't need to go into those, because for a company, do you manage your cash flow? Are you disciplined in execution? And the stuff that people like you and I are trained to look for. And I shan't spend any time. I call them natural risks. But the second risk, which has been my personal learning, and maybe it's self-evident. Personal learning always looks obvious and self-evident once you've been through the mill, is the owner's ego. It is a horrible disease. Now here's a very funny situation. If the owner must be slightly narcissistic, otherwise nothing will start. There's nothing to start up. But his ego is a self-consuming one. And there's a difference between ego and passion. I'm not an expert to the extent I have had, and I've had two parallel experiences. Both were startups, both are about 10 years old, both were sponsored by Tatas, because Tata Sons acts a bit like a private equity firm, or an investment arm, if you want to call it that. But they've come out with very different outcomes. Now 10 years later, when I'm ready to step down as chairman, I can see one of them has quadrupled its value, and the other one has destroyed its value. And the only difference I see between the two is one was very, very evocative, charming, but hopelessly egoistic. The other one was very middle class, conservative in sending its money, but it's quadrupled its value. So I'm somehow of the view that in startups you must recognize that there's a natural evolutionary gradient of growth and there's this dramatic growth. We are enamored with the dramatic growth. But dramatic growth, like hybrid cows or like hybrid plants or BT cotton plants, also have many dangers to their existence. And one needs to take care of it. When I worry about the startup mania in India right now, my colleagues who are better versed in economics than I am tell me, oh, it's a small bubble. If you look at the total size of the financial sector, nothing much will happen. These things will keep happening. And I hope they are right. But if you read the newspaper in the Economic Times, you'll get the feeling that everything else is dead and it's all about startups and entrepreneurship. So I take examples from how nature does these things because the metaphor makes the point very subtly without getting expansive. First of all, you see how species keep young. Animals mold, birds, snakes, they shed their whole skin. In fact, human beings also mold. We shed our skin and it renews itself at a cycle of every 3 months or thereabouts. So molting is a form of corporate renewal. The second one, if I had the slides here, you would see that in a picturesque way, they appear in front of you. The second one is pain. Expecting dramatic results which are painless evolutions is impractical. And the famous story of the caterpillar is something all of us have been through, how much pain it goes through before a caterpillar becomes a beautiful butterfly. Somehow once it's become a butterfly, just like once you've raised your son and he's gone to Stanford, Harvard, and he's got a damn good job, somebody thinks you had an easy ride. But you as a parent know that you went through a certain set of phases. And the last one is the reality that in physiology they are discovering, it's a new thing in the last 5-10 years, that human beings are more bacteria than human. I don't know how many of you know this, but we got 10 times the number of bacteria in our gut compared to the number of human genome. So we are all bacteria passing off as human beings. And these bacteria are fighting good and bad bacteria in your stomach. You need both of them, by the way. And that is the reason why our NRI cousins, when they come here, the first sip of water and they fall sick, because they don't have enough bad bacteria. Whereas you and I have probably so much bad bacteria that when we go abroad, we need to get some bad water to keep our system going. And companies are the same. There are good bacteria and there are bad bacteria. Good practices, bad practices. Good review systems, bad review systems. And there's a battle going on between the process orientation and the entrepreneurship. So I want to close because, as I said, I want to really hear your views. And if you totally disagree, I shall be enriched by your observations because you're sitting in this kind of sector or adjacent to this sector. I've come with 5 or 6 lessons that it doesn't matter what the startup idea is, it doesn't matter how charming he is, it doesn't matter how engaging the person is, how passionate he is, all these are useful to know, just like when you interview a potential CEO or a CFO candidate. But there are 6 myths that exist. And I just wanted to touch upon that before I close. First, that it's essential to be first in the market. This is a big myth. It's nice to be first in the market. But in an industry, especially the digital industries where others can catch up much faster, unlike an auto or a steel industry, it is not essential to be first in the market. If I ask a young person like my son today, who invented personal computers, he may say Dell or Apple probably. But the truth of the matter is, even before Apple was formed, forget about launched as a company, there was a company when I was studying in college called MITS, M-I-T-S, which launched a home computer called Altair. And as a young student, I remember reading in Electronics Today about the Altair computer, which will change the world. But that was 1966 and 1976, and Apple came soon after. Altair is gone. So it's not the first who comes to the market that's but the last who can stay that makes the difference. And people assume that it's essential to be first in the market and rush into the market with inadequately tested products on the ground that their competitive advantage will be lost. The second point I want to make is R&D. There's a great fixation in the world that R&D is a measure of innovation. And I have not found that to be so. It's a metric. It's like when you look at a company, return on equity is a metric, but you can't become a slave of return on equity. I sit on the board of another company where the CEO has decided that to make it simple, ROS will be the metric. So wherever he goes, he says, what's your ROS? And if it is not 6 or 5 or 9 or whatever number he's looking for, then that particular subsidiary gets a walloping. But you look at R&D, in the pharma industry, Merck is one of the largest, BMS is one of the largest spending companies, but whether they are the most successful in R&D, and as a result of that, their commercial results, is not so clear. Apple spends less R&D than some of its peers, and yet it is not in any way disadvantaged. The third myth I find is that innovation in services is very difficult. Innovation in products is much easier. You somehow think that if there's a chemistry process, a metallurgical process, an engineering modification process, you can make lasting innovations. At the end of the day, the innovation has to be magnetic. Whether you're a bank, a hotel, or a software company, you have to have a magnetic experience. And magnetic experience is equal to functional superiority multiplied by, not plus, but multiplied by emotion. If you can produce the emotion, and services rely more on emotion than on functionality. That's why you get, I sometimes wonder about banks, whether they realize how much damage they do to themselves by pesky calls, because it's an irritation to keep getting awkward calls from somebody in Gurgaon asking whether you want your 55th credit card when you can't cope with the first 54. So one experience I've had is at the Taj Hotel. At the end of the day, the food is the food. You can have a flourish of the chef, but it's the emotionality of experience that people have. And that came into full display when 26/11 happened in the Taj. And we got some of the most touching letters, which none of us is responsible for, but which our predecessors had built up of a love for the Taj. And there are other institutions like this. The fourth is the world gets infatuated with innovation, which is a big bet. If you do this, the world will change. And I'm not saying there is no place for a big bet. There is a place for big bets, and there are the Steve Jobs of the world who take the big bets. But most of us should be realistic to accept that we are not Steve Jobs. We would all love to be thought of as Steve Jobs. We may dream about it, and nothing wrong with that. Who you know, one of us may be. Most companies are equipped with people who are Vikram Limaye, Gopalakrishnan, and ordinary people. And in my experience in Unilever and Tata, I found that taking small measured steps is a far bigger source of innovation than the huge big bet that books talk about. And last, of course, I would like to close by saying innovation need not be elitist, expensive, or new. It must be touching lives of people, and it must be difficult to replicate. And I take the most dumb but self-evident example. We market a product called Tata Salt. It will never get any newspaper reportage. It doesn't get anybody's attention. But Tata Salt is the world's biggest volume of branded salt. World's biggest. But you don't hear about it. And it has happened because we were the first to pump out seawater, evaporate the water, use it for the chemical plant, and we didn't know what to do with this white product that was left. And one Gujarati Baniya came, this is before my time obviously, and said, I can pack it, you allow me to use the Tata name, and I will market it. He set up packing units, he set up invoicing, logistics, cash collection, and when Gujarati Baniya sets up these things, he does a pretty decent job of it, And he just said, give me permission to use the Tata name. And somebody must have said, you're selling the salt for 2 rupees a kilo, give me 25 paise or 1 rupee and 50 paise and you keep the rest. And that's how we have built up almost a billion kilograms of salt which is quite a stunning. It's a very odd but difficult to replicate. It's not easy for somebody to replicate it. Hindustan Lever Distribution System. In the financial services area, financial inclusion, these are all challenges. And therefore I wonder why no innovation literature talks about the number of lives it touches. I say, how many people has Apple touched? 1 billion in the world? But how many people can the Indian voting system touch? You know, there's no comparison between the two. So, this is, of course, Prahlad made it very famous by calling it bottom of the pyramid, which is a very difficult area because it's very difficult to find that fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, but the opportunity exists. So I would like to close there, and Vikram, if there is 10 minutes for me to get your feedback, I want to enrich my presentation. I've come here with a selfish interest, not to deliver any gyan, but to take away some of your comments or insights. And if you don't agree with me, that's fine. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be here and learn from my friends over here. Thank you. Have you got 10 minutes for me to just get some feedback? If anybody disagrees or totally agrees, and then after this you can get into nitty-gritty stuff like what am I doing with my company, where it's heading, which is what you're really here for.
Sir, I don't have a disagreement, but I have a follow-up question on, this is Anish Damania from IDFC. A follow-up question on what you said, and this is a question which I would ask you. So what are the new business opportunities in the new environment which you would be looking at as a group? If you could throw some light on that.
So what you're saying is, will you please stop talking about other things, tell me about Tata.
No. Or generally what you would say would be the new growth opportunity, irrespective of whether you take it up or not.
See, the reason I didn't want to talk about Tata, I was telling Vikram, is there is before Christ and after Christ. So I am before Cyrus. I belong to before Cyrus. And I think these questions are best answered by people who come AC, after Cyrus. What is there in the public domain is there, and I don't want to expand a lot because I'll get drawn into a discussion during my last 4 weeks of association with Tata. So if you don't mind, I will not answer that specific question.
Okay, so I'll go back.
Okay.
So you have what are your experiences with respect to acquisition abroad, and what are the challenges which you faced versus what were the advantages which you derived?
That's a fair question, and I'm prepared to engage on that. I'll give you my perceptions of my experiences, and I'm not going to make generic statements about industry. I may make a passing reference, but that's a personal opinion, so please don't take it as well-researched stuff. If you look at the Western model of acquisitions and globalization, they've happened over 50, 70 years following colonial flags. That's how Unilever came here. So they happened over a long period of time. And Western companies, without announcing that this is their strategy, have followed the following action plan. Buy a company after doing all the studies that you have to do, then immediately transform that company into your clone. So the brass plate outside will change. You'll probably change the top level leadership. Your systems, processes for HR, finance, internal controls will be implemented, and they will start to promote your brands or your technology. I call this the Alexander approach of acquisition. I have signed the check, now you do it my way. If I look at the more recent experience of Indian globalization, we have followed the Ashoka form of acquisition, not the Alexander form. It's not only Tata, but I won't talk about other companies by name, but you look at any of the major acquisitions. We acquired companies and said, a very different philosophy, there must be something good about you, that you're worth $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion. What are your ambitions that you would like to express? Because we can learn and take some of them back to our home company, but we also have some systems which can come back to your company. So there is the Alexander way of doing things, there's the Emperor Ashoka way of doing things. Tatas have clearly followed the Emperor Ashoka way of doing things. So that's the first point. The second point is, in hindsight, you can always make statements that you bought it too high at the wrong time or the right time. But I have been surprised, things that at the time of our acquisition we thought ye nikal jayega, got stuck. And things that we said ye nahi niklega have flown. So I think in a period of 5 or 7 years, 10 years that we have been at it, one lesson that I would take away, and I'm not speaking for Tata Group now, is there is a merit in the Alexander approach. Get hold of it, you sign the check, and start to do whatever you think you want to do as per the business plan you made at the time of your acquisition. The second is, it doesn't matter how much analysis you do. The biggest mythology that's been created is the science of valuation, the so-called science of valuation. It's all hocus pocus. Now, I'm using deliberately provocative words not to dismiss it, because all accountancy is hocus pocus. You know, it's an imaginary statement of the state of affairs with a lot of caveats and so on. Cash is definitely real. I mean, there is no doubt about it. But everything else, and I'm deliberately using a provocative statement to make my point in brevity. So valuations, you call valuers, you get 5 people with 10 valuations. Anything between 100 rupees a share to 300 rupees a share, depending on whether you method A, method B, method C. But really speaking, it is the cultural integration. And one of the things I learned which is useful is to do a cultural due diligence. People do financial due diligence, legal due diligence, operational due diligence, but I have not known too many who do a cultural due diligence. We have walked away from 1 or 2 acquisitions on the basis of our cultural due diligence. And I think that's a good practice, which I have learned from. So have I given you a rough picture? I could go on and on, but then that's not the purpose.
Mr. Gopalakrishnan, thanks for that talk. You know, I wonder whether you sometimes think you're old-fashioned. Because today, and if you look at startups or the startup universe, I mean, most people think that, startups can only be disruptive. Unless you're disruptive, you're not a startup. And if you look at the language that, surrounds startups, it's all about owning the universe, it's all about capturing the customer, it's all about, taking over the market. And people don't realize that startups are all about, rather than doing that, making that little difference in the world. And I think a lot of this comes primarily from the fact that there is so much money chasing it. So you have, an entire ecosystem starting from the angel investor who doesn't know what to do with his money and therefore looking for that disruptive idea, to the venture capitalist, to finally even the investment banker, as you were saying, like many of them who are sitting out here. And therefore, I think, isn't it a self-created kind of situation which we have brought ourselves into, instead of saying, can we make a dent in the universe, to how do we disrupt?
I agree with you totally. I didn't get your name, sorry?
Sashi Krishnan.
Sashi?
Krishnan.
Krishnan. I totally agree with you. The trouble is, when I say this to people of my son's age group, they say, oh dad, you're so old-fashioned. So I hesitate to say it. But I agree with you 100%. This is unvirtuous money chasing unvirtuous products and creating and I'm not saying this in a deprecatory way, asset managers have hard work to do. They got a sum of money, they are accountable, their NAVs are tracked, and there's a science or mumbo jumbo, art, skill, and there are hard-working assets that are working, real stuff happening for them, as distinct from this stuff. And I can't help feeling reassured by your comment that mine is not a polarized or a prejudiced view. I agree. Yes, sir. There's a microphone.
So always good to hear from you, Utsav here. I agree with most what you said. I think, and I'll just give you my personal view, not as an asset manager or investor, but what I see in India is, if this entire startup boom is not without substance, then it's not actually too bad for us, because this is the largest transfer of foreign money to Indian consumers who need that money through all the discounts and all that. So if this entire thing is all a bubble, then the Indian consumers won, foreign investors have perhaps lost, but India on the whole has gained. If indeed there are going to be a few Googles, Facebooks equivalents which get created in India, then again India is the winner. So I think that while we all worry about the bubble, I don't really worry too much about this hurting India in any way. I think it's very positive. People at a very young age are being given the opportunity to learn by failing, which at least when I graduated from business school, and that's not even many years back, I didn't have the chance to go start something, get funded, fail. I took a much slower path of learning. So I think this will create a better environment, more better entrepreneurs, better corporate leaders over time in India. Because even if this fails, a bunch of people will emerge after having learned in a very similar manner, which happened for maybe 2 years in the .com phase in India. So that's my sort of perspective. So I felt that you were a little bit worried. I don't think we need to be worried, is my view.
Well, that's a very helpful comment. I don't think I would describe myself as worried. I think about it, which means there are some phases when you're worried. And I'm not thinking about it in terms of whether it will have an impact, negative impact on the Indian economy or something as big as that. I'm saying, what will the world, Indian business world look like 25 years from now? Will it be richer with management talent or poorer? Would you have a large number of people who have, and it's an open question, I'm not suggesting that these are all bad managers, but there was a certain amount of nurture and nourish in creating global leaders. That is missing. So I'll take a metaphor again from sports. As you know, until 40 years ago, in the field of tennis or golf or anything else, there was no professional. Then the professionals came in cricket, golf, tennis. And then they would focus, and then they would make a global hero out of a little kid who's 14, 15 years old. And if those of you who are fond of tennis will remember a young lady from Florida called Jennifer Capriati. And at 16, she was a global, if you read Andre Agassi's book, Open, you'll see what a pressure and tension it was. So they become global celebrities, and then they are broken psychologically, physiologically. In the case of Andre Agassi, of course, he recovered from it. In the case of Jennifer Capriati, she did not. So those are the things that bother me about what it does to the human being. We also want India to be global. Will these guys become global leaders? And it is not one or the other. You know, there's a place for both. And sometimes within my own group, when I see managers exchanging notes, it looks as though, oh, that's all dead. Old world. There is no technology there. Steel, motors, chemicals. These are seen as some fuddy-duddies who are waiting to go to Chandanwadi. They're just waiting in the queue. And that the maternity ward full of these eager beaver guys with long hair and Rasputin-like eyes are the future. We work our lives on language and metaphor. That is what worries me, not the actual. So I agree with you. But the actual economic impact of it is a bit unclear. It may turn out the way you say. But I'm thinking of a generation of people who raised reading the current Economic Times. Nothing wrong with the Economic Times, by the way. They have chosen as a strategy to glorify the startups and entrepreneurs. They are now giving awards for guys who run up the highest cash losses in the shortest time. So I'm just worrying what sort of guys these guys will be when they are 50 years old. But it's a worry. Maybe appropriate to my age. Any other?
Yeah, sir, here. Hello. Yeah. My name is Govin. Sir, you gave few characteristics about the companies which have lived long, 100 years, few hundred years. And few names, which comes to my mind are like Bosch for that matter, or Nestle and P&G and of course Unilever. Even though the founders are not there, but these companies have remained the leaders for all these years,
Had remained?
The leaders, global leaders. Now, if you look at the more recent names like Google or Apple, and off late now maybe Uber or Airbnb, etc., these are, most of them are first generation entrepreneurs, right? But suddenly you see they're becoming global leaders in the space in which they are operating. So what I observe that in, say, maybe US or in some countries in the Western world, there is an ecosystem which has been developed, which comes here to guide that entrepreneur. Maybe the Facebook, from the college dropout to becoming a global leader. Do you see that ecosystem getting developed in India? Because I think it's very important, because a 20-year-old man would not have that kind of the understanding or experience, except that about that technology he would have some handle on. So is that getting developed in India? If yes, how is it, and where is Tata present in this space?
Okay, I'm giving you a personal view, which, if you disagree, please do so. This is an engine, whether it's California or anywhere else, which is running on an artificial fuel of low-cost money. Money chasing ideas. The world has come from the beginning of Jesus Christ right up to maybe 50 years ago with ideas chasing money. In the last 30-40 years, due to a set of events which I'm sure all of you are better equipped to debate than I, it's turned the other way around. So like they say, the sex ratio is wrong. So boys are chasing girls or girls are chasing boys because the ratio is wrong. The same thing has happened here. This ecosystem will vanish. Oh, no, let me make the statement provocatively, with which you may or may not agree. If you had interest rates and the cost of the money was not what it is now, but is several points higher, will you have this ecosystem? I don't know. I'm not sure. You may have the innovativeness, but will you have this ecosystem? I don't know. What do you feel? Is the ecosystem a creation of the state of money, or is the money a creation of the ecosystem? What do you think? Because you refer to ecosystem.
Specifically finance or the interest rate, it is just not, to my mind, it is just not the interest rate or the money. Of course, money is a big part, which, as my friend pointed out, there's a lot of money which is chasing, so which we are also seeing in India. It is coming because of the entrepreneurship here. But it is, the people who come together and they are behind him to guide him, and then, the whole system comes together, and then, he takes it forward. The money is just one part.
Okay. Maybe I have I think money is the major part. I agree with you, money is only one part, but I see the availability of inexpensive money as a very major part. Whether it's 60-70%, I don't know. So, coming back to your question, you're saying, one of the things I do worry about is whether the money will continue to be as inexpensive as it is now, and what will it do to the ecosystem. Because I am of the view that the ecosystem is a product of the money and not the other way around, with which one could agree perhaps to some extent and not 100%.
I just have an organizational question based on your experience with the Tata Group, and in hindsight, do you believe large organizations and groups have the right environment to incubate and to develop successful startup companies, in your own experience with the Tata Group, as opposed to a situation where you now find certain business groups allocating capital, saying that, okay, we're going to fund startups, but they may not be part of the group. They would be external companies, and the groups would be more financial investors, rather than in the Tata system where companies were actually nurtured, developed, and you use the group infrastructure to develop companies internally. In hindsight, do you believe that large groups have the right environment to facilitate successful startups?
I think all startups have some group behind them. You may call them venture, PE, they're also a group. I think there's a cycle in this thought about large groups and small groups. For example, conglomerates were bashed I remember from the late 70s, early 80s. And Mr. The Omaha, what is his name? The Bishop of Omaha, what is the Warren Buffett has made conglomerates reasonably fashionable. It almost looks like Tata is now going to be fashionable after 5-10 years. So my first point is, there will always be place for large conglomerates and startups. Just like in nature, there's a place for an elephant, there's a place for a fly and a lizard. It's not that one is going to exterminate the other. That's the first point I want to make. If a particular species, in this case large conglomerates, cannot create the environment, there are challenges. Like the dinosaur, they will go. But there will be several who will. And the third and the last comment I would like to make in response to your point about specifically about Tatas. So most people don't consider Tatas to be entrepreneurial. If I did a straw poll, I think hands will go up with great reluctance out of politeness rather than conviction. But I undertook a research study, and I don't mind in a brazen way accepting the authorship of this. What is the history of innovation and entrepreneurship in Tata's over the last 150 years? And I published it internally as a little book through Tata Management Training Center. It's a stunning record. Tata's is a story that other people don't know because you've chosen not to tell the story. So there is some method Tata has, and I've tried to decodify what that method is by taking these examples over 100 years, saying what is it that made Tata entrepreneurial. Whether that form will last forever by itself is definitely an open question. It might have virtue, it might have worked at a particular point of time. So we are also experimenting with new formats of the kind that you mentioned. And I don't think we have enough experience of that to say, but one thing we do have experience of, our style is not dead. There may be additional new styles coming in. That much I can say.
My question was more along the lines of, you keep hearing that, and that's not about Tatas. You look at even technology companies, and the general view is whether it's an Infosys or a TCS, once they grow to a certain size, they always worry whether they are able to develop enough of an entrepreneurial spirit, or are able to encourage enough of an entrepreneurial spirit internally to remain ahead of the curve, to encourage new ideas, to commercialize new ideas fast enough if they were to appear within the organization. So my question was more in an organizational construct and in a cultural construct. Because of size and what a large group brings or does not bring to the table, to facilitate innovation, what has your experience been from that perspective? Not that obviously Tata's has got into various new businesses over time quite successfully and have developed innovation in existing businesses.
Some not so successful.
But this concern that not only groups but even companies which are not conglomerates, generally even IBM went through the same thing. Are we agile enough? Are we encouraging entrepreneurship in a way that will keep us ahead of the curve? Will we become redundant because we're just too large and we're not able to think about what's going on around us and react fast enough, etc., etc.?
No, I think I understand the question you're raising, and I am somehow seeing it as a very positive thing. Just like no human being can lead his life without uljhan. Right? क्या पढ़ूं मैं, किस प्रोफेशन पे जाऊं, कितनी कमाई को बचाऊं, कितने को what is right, what is wrong. We all go through life with this uljan. Companies also have uljans, and to deny that you have an uljan will get you definitely into the grave. These are reflections of companies which have either fallen into the uljan or have recognized it. So if an Infosys or a TCS says that we have to be faster and more agile and I'm working on it, it only demonstrates to me a live management, that there is an issue and they're trying to tackle it in multiple ways. So I see it as a very positive thing. And I think those who succeed in finding alternate ways, I have chaired the Tata Group Innovation Forum for the last 10 years, I've just stepped down, and I've seen that to change culture is very much more difficult than to introduce new processes. But people are responsive. But for cultural change, you have to allow 20 years. A generation has to go. Right? Ratan Tata started with great vision, I would say, in 1992-93 to bring the Tata Group together. And You could even argue now that we haven't got quite as firm a grip as we would ourselves like. I see that as a sign of strength, that you're willing to admit it, that we need to do much more. But then, if you see the generation of people who sat around the board table during JRD's time, if you see the generation of number of people who sat around the board table during the time I joined, which is after JRD's time, and now as I see the next chairman and the kind of people who are sitting there, there's a big difference. I'm not arguing who's better or who's worse, because each one had his or her, their respective strengths. But they're different for sure. And to me, that's a sign of adaptiveness. It's a positive thing. Few mistakes will happen. So I've answered your question, that cultural change is what large companies need to address rather than process change. And that's my experience in Tata's.
Yeah, no, that was what I was driving at, just the culture of large groups, whether that bogs people down in terms of the ability to innovate and move fast enough. That was, but you've addressed it.
So my next question would be around catalyst. There are certain catalysts in an environment which either facilitates or triggers the birth of a startup. Now, we are definitely experiencing a phase where we see media glamorizing startups, as you said. And that has encouraged a lot of talented people who would otherwise have good, cushy jobs with either consulting firms or investment banks to leave their profession and get into startups. So what are these catalysts doing? Are they favorably working for us in the long term, or do you see them deterring us, by glamorizing the wrong startups and the wrong way of doing business?
What are the who's doing for you then?
Pardon me?
Your last part I missed, your question.
I'm saying that what are the new catalysts that you see in the environment around you, which is actually glamorizing startups, and how do you see that impacting us going forward? Is it going to promote the wrong way of doing business, as you said, or is it going to trigger a new generation of people who will not have a very set way of thinking, but will actually be encouraged to think on new ideas and take more risks?
Okay. In case I've given the impression that I worry about startups, that's the wrong impression. So I first want to clarify, I think it's one of the best things that's happened here in startups. I think it's encouraging young people, it's catalyzing an energy, whether it becomes $1 trillion or $500 billion, we'll see. Many of them will fail. That's all very, very encouraging. It shows energy, enthusiasm, innovation, entrepreneurship, all the stuff that you want. What I do worry about is whether this form of entrepreneurship is sufficiently broad-based for social good. Everybody comes with the same idea. Oh, I'll connect women who can cook at home with bachelors who want to eat the food. I will make people who make blue shirts, seeing on WhatsApp how they would look in a blue shirt or a red shirt, and they can buy it. This, what I call wiring type of innovation, is predominating. Almost every idea I listen to, is basically wiring up one guy to the other. And it doesn't take much. Once you know that there's a bijli in that wire, you also can put a wire. That's why you find multiple people. And then the race, that winner takes all, happens. And you're seeing that in the e-commerce area. But there are many other fields. I haven't seen all the entrepreneurs, there may be some, who will say, I'm going to wire up 50 million farmers in this country. That will make a difference to the lives of 400 million people. It's probably more challenging for a startup to take, and maybe the Tatas and the levers have to do that kind of thing. But apart from that one aspect, and that will also come, I think it's a very positive thing. I'm very energized by it. And the risk-taking, as somebody said when I started my career, I think Mr. Krishnan said, there were none of those options. So you just look for a secure job. Your grandmother said, don't ever leave that job, and you stuck onto it. And then you become like, happily retired or whatever. But now young people think very differently. And I think these are all signs of good change. But please remember, this accounts for 0.5% of the population of India. And we are living in that 0.5% island, intellectual island, social island. And that's all we see. The part of my job is, I'm sure for some of you, is to go out there and see what's happening. And there are lots of people out there. India is like an escalator. Some people are living in the 21st century, very, very few people. Many people are living in the 19th century, 20th century, 21st century, and somehow if you don't have a lifeline for them, then this island will become a bit threatened. So, but that somebody should be, setting the place on fire and moving along is not in doubt, and I think it's a very good thing. And at the end of the day, the educated, better off people have to do it. Okay, at least nobody has thrown eggs at me, which means that at least the hypothesis that I put to you is not out of place. But I thank you very much for the time you have invested in Vikram, for the opportunity to meet very accomplished and distinguished people who have a much better exposure to the financial field than I. I will develop my theories further. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you very much.